just going to recording. Thanks for joining us for the already fourth session today. This afternoon we will look into different actors, processes and structures relevant to global education politics with the aim of acquiring a deeper understanding of the sector and also how to make the students' voice meaningfully heard within. We do so with two incredible speakers who throughout their careers have been influencing many important education policies and decisions. They are two outstanding education leaders. Took the time to join us this Sunday, and it's my pleasure to welcome Camilla Croso and Fred van Leeuwen with us. Camilla is the director of the education program at the Open Society Foundations. She has worked in promoting the right to education at national, regional and global levels for 20 years. Prior to joining OSF, she coordinated the Latin American campaign for the right to education and served as the president of the Global Campaign for Education, which you know from 2 weeks ago when Grant was here to tell us about the organization. Camilla holds a Master of Science from the London School of Economics in Social Policy and Planning in developing countries and is currently undergoing also a PhD. She served on the regional and global SDG Education 2030 steering committees, as well as the board of the Global Partnership for Education. So a lot of experience she brings with her to this lecture. Camilla, thank you for taking the time for this. And I'm going to also introduce our second lecturer today, Fred van Leeuwen. He is a former teacher and union official in the Netherlands. He was the General Secretary of the International Federation of Free Teachers Unions, the IFFTU, from 1981 until 1993, when he was one of the co-founders and architects of Education International. He was the organization's general secretary from 1993 till 2018, so quite some years. And under his leadership, Education International became the voice of the teaching profession and the international community, representing 386 national education unions in 178 countries, with a combined membership of 32.5 million. Fred is also the author of a book that you already know, that is in your inboxes and on the drive, the 25 lessons, Education and Democracy, the lessons from the teaching profession, which we will share also after this lecture one more time, so you have it. I would say we get started, and as agreed with the lecturers, we would start with Camilla's intervention and then give you the time for Q&A, then move on to Fred's intervention, and after that open again the floor for questions and answers. Camilla, thank you very much, and over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Sebastian, for the invitation. Thank you, Global Student Forum. It's a huge pleasure to be with all of you. It's also a really big pleasure to see Fred again, whom I haven't seen for quite a long time. So lovely to be sharing this panel and this moment with all of you. It's a very interesting framing that you have put to us, to Fred and I, for a conversation, for a dialogue this morning. And I will share a few reflections. So I think a starting point that might be interesting for us is to look at how the international discourse in education politics has been changing over the past decades. If we look at the EFA movement, let's say, that started in Jomtien in 1990, that passed through Dakar in 2000, and then Incheon in 2015, and now we're at this moment. And of course, Incheon, plus the approval of the SDGs in the same year, 2015. So if we look at this process, it's quite interesting to see how the discourse has been changing, how the nuances have been changing, and also how the actors engaged in the process have been changing, right? So from a place where we were discussing back in 1990 basic learning needs, which was like a concept that was being promoted very much at that time, and the EFA movement was launched, fundamentally being convened by UNESCO, UNICEF, and the World Bank. If we look at how it has progressed in 2000, I would say that the agenda already was broadened up. The civil society movement engaged profoundly from 2000 onwards. In fact, 1999 was the year that the Global Campaign for Education was launched, and many actors from civil society decided to articulate themselves and, came together to look at what had been the past decade from 1990 to 2000, but also fundamentally to prepare working together from then on, let's say. And so I think that in the year of 2000 in the car, really was a fundamental moment where we expanded on a set of objectives where we put education financing center stage in a very important way, but a moment fundamentally where different actors of civil society really started to articulate much more together. And it's also interesting that in this decade, I don't know, perhaps Sebastian, maybe we colleagues can mute.
Yes, I'm quick finger, but not quick enough.
No problem. But so there was this process of coming together, and also of within the civil society movement as well in this decade after 2000, right, from 2000 onwards, different regional actors started really to take shape in a much stronger way, and different actors actually came into place. So, for example, the CAR declaration created a space, called for a global mechanism of education financing coordination, right? And it turned out that this mechanism, which was initially envisaged to be coordinated by UNESCO, at the end of the day ended up being launched and triggered by the World Bank. It was called Fast Track Initiative, which then became the Global Partnership for Education. So very interesting that from the CAR moment, let's say, there was this process of articulation of civil society actors. Teacher union, obviously Fred is here to tell the story as well, but highly engaging and participating in all of this process, but also different actors coming into play. And interesting to remember also that there was an initiative called GEFI, Global Education First Initiative, that was launched by the UN, Ban Ki-moon at that time. And it was an interesting, in my opinion, precursor perhaps of what then would be a closer dialogue between the UNESCO-led movements and dialogues and conversations, a UNESCO-led vis-a-vis a more UN-led process, which is how of course, we know that both Millennium Development Goals and Sustainable Development Goals, they rotated around the UN. But if we remember in 2000 as well, after the CAR Framework for Action was approved, we had the MDGs, Millennium Development Goals, that actually reduced the agenda very much. Remember that, colleagues. And so, whereas the CAR Framework for Action was quite broad, the MDGs that were approved in September, one was in April, the other one was in September, actually focused on primary education, universal primary education, and gender parity. So there was an issue during all this time regarding, okay, so these two different agendas, and one much more reduced than the other, which one really prevailed and which one managed to actually influence politics in a more prominent way. The Incheon Declaration and Incheon process that started to be negotiated, a whole interesting difference, because what we were attempting at that time of negotiation, which lasted between 2013, 14, and 15, so 3 very intense years of negotiations, was actually to ensure a broad agenda was put forward, that all the leverage around the UNESCO movement and the AFA movement and education movement community was still there. So we ensured a framework for action, but at the same time, we struggled very much, and I think successfully so, that the SDG 4 negotiated simultaneously in New York, let's say at the headquarters of the UN, and along with other 16 Sustainable Development Goals, was exactly the same framework as what was informing the Education 2030 Framework for Action, which derived from the Incheon Declaration. So these processes, the SDG 4 negotiation in New York, the Incheon Declaration, and then in November, what was an expanded Education 2030 Framework for Action, they hold the same narrative, let's say, and the same objectives. There was no longer, let's say, a reductionism happening in New York. On the contrary, what we managed to do during the negotiation process was always topping up the ambition. So, for example, free primary and secondary this narrative first appeared in the New York SDG 4 scenario, which we then said, okay, that has to be our starting point, 12 years of free education. We cannot go below what is being discussed in New York. We always have to strive higher. So these 3 years were very fundamental because we managed to articulate what was an education community and that history that comes from EFA with what is happening with the other broader community, not just the education community. And we do have the same narrative. So that is it's a very interesting, let's say, outcome. And very, very useful because we managed to articulate civil society along the way and the education community very intensely throughout all of this process of negotiation. But I think very importantly, and I do think that this is a turning point that is informing things post 2015, and I think we need to take advantage of this always moving forward, is that education community really articulated more organically, more intensely with other sectors, right? No longer so much siloed in an education community around UNESCO only, but actually in dialogue, not only with, let's say, UN agencies, but fundamentally also with civil society communities that was looking at gender issues, that were looking at the environment, that were looking at health, water, all of the other conversations and discussions happening around the other 16 SDGs. The education community was more integrated. And I think that this is something for us to bear in mind as we move forward, right? So I would say that fundamentally, these would be my highlights in terms of like the story of how the political discourse is unfolding. But 2015 on, we have been actually seeing a very complex world. So we got a very good outcome from my own perspective with its own, remembering also that higher education was included in that framework for the first time. Higher education was not there in Jomtien or Dakar, but it was introduced in the Incheon Declaration and Education 2030 Framework for Action around the financing, big wins such as 12 years of free education, and also remembering we included the principle of progressive realization of free education beyond the compulsory, which is in human rights framework. So we managed to add that in. There were many gains, governance issues where we mentioned youth and students who had not been part of the conversation, and this is a key issue for this panel that we are now discussing right now, and also tax justice. So within the financing issues, there's a huge component. There's a component of tax justice which is fundamental. And there was a huge struggle around Incheon of measurable learning outcomes being initially in 2013. That was the key thing that around which conversation of education were happening, and what was successfully done was moving away from that to a much broader perspective of education that was not just focusing on measurable learning outcomes. If you read the whole framework fraction, you will see it there, but it's situated within a broader perspective. Post 2015, those same actors, strengths, forces, tensions that appeared during the negotiations keep on going. They don't disappear, right? So still there is a push for narrowness. Still, we have issues of we have huge issues of education privatization, but we do have anchors there that protect public education or that highlight public education as key in the right to education, in promoting the right to education, etc. So the tension points continue. But what I do think, and the struggles, we can never take any win for granted. That's what I've learned during my entire trajectory. We have wins and we protect these wins with the same kind of energy. Never ever take a success for granted. Like regression can always take place, and we're always fighting at the same time for progression and resistance of regression. It's always there. Like the forces are always they're always present. It's a constant. That's why we have to keep each other, ourselves, strengthened, articulated, in dialogue, oxygenated, energized, because it is a constant struggle to maintain and progress, right? But I think what I do want to say is that I think that there are external factors that come after 2015 that we need to take account for. So there were many regressive governments that were put in place, that were elected. We have seen a decrease in democracy, starting from my country, including my country, Brazil. I don't know, Sebastian, if you mentioned, I'm Brazilian. So what is happening in Brazil with Bolsonaro, and then all the different, well, the Trump and the many other authoritarian governments that we have seen on the rise, this phenomena of extreme right is something that we as educators have to pay full attention. And therefore the implementation of SDG 4 and the education framework fraction makes it all the more complex. Climate, I think that is something that was always there, but I think it's on the rise. The problematics, as we have been seeing and testified now in COP. COVID, of course, right? Absolutely a central, my goodness, it changed our context, it changed our scenario. And of course, we as an education community, therefore, we are having to implement the SDG 4, taking into account a very regressive scenario post 2015, right? And so how is it that we can, at the same time, be pushing for those implementations, but you know, emphasizing and responding to climate justice? So phenomenal that we have managed as a community around COP to put climate education right there at the forefront. How do we deal with these rising authoritarianisms that we are seeing in dogmas, right? So we have those extreme right governments that are on the rise, but we also have to look, for example, at issues around religious fundamentalisms that are also out there as a scenario. How is it that we, as an education community, interrogate this and analyze this, and how do we relate to the problematics, right? The COVID scenario, which has exposed so much, but it has exposed so much inequalities. It has made it crystal clear the inequalities that had pre-existed, and unfortunately made them even deeper. But they also showed so much around the need to strengthen public systems, education, health, all public systems. So the value of the public came to the forefront. At the same time, the whole COVID scenario splashed out the whole issue of ed tech, the importance of strengthening the teaching profession, which was always there as a need, but that became crystal clearer, let's say, or exposed the tension of homeschooling, of technologies and distance learning and all of that. It was put into check. From my perspective, we need to build on the extent to which we have seen the importance of strengthening the teaching profession, strengthening public education systems, strengthening the dialogue between the education community, and having EdTech at the service of all of this, not denying it, but having it at the service of a strengthened education system, strengthened teaching profession, strengthened critical thinking and learning, right? These have to be put at the service of these objectives, right? And I just want to say one more thing in terms of the landscape that I think is really important for us to be looking at, which is the issue of gender. So during the trajectory that we had discussed since John Tiem until Incheon and beyond, let's say, how there was so the feminist community and the education community, let's say, were much more in dialogue back then and prior actually to the car. And then actually the reductionism of around gender parity and the instrumentalization of women's education to serve market needs shifted these communities away from each other. And more recently, and I think if we look at the Incheon Declaration, you already see a narrative and an attempt to go way beyond gender parity. We're talking about gender equality, we're talking about patriarchy and really the politics of power and how that is interplaying into everything, into society and education as both a place where you either foster patriarchy or combat it, but patriarchy as a topic, starts to come back into the agenda. And this is key to re-articulate these movements, education and feminist movements, right? In the same way that we should be articulating with the environment movement, education and community, education and environment movements, in the same way we should be articulating much more with the feminist movements and placing patriarchy and talking about feminism in a much more unapologetic manner, central manner, like really be there with them. And that has a lot of implications in terms of how we look at gender equality and through education, how we look at sex ed, integral sex ed, for example, among other issues that we need to re-articulate in a much more robust manner. So if we look, for example, at the GPE, Global Partnership for Education, and its own gender narrative, it is now talking much more about gender equality. And that is, so there are positive developments, but I do want to highlight the importance of, talking of the education community taking on an anti-patriarchal, a feminist perspective in a much more radical manner. I am wary of time. I know that I have 10 minutes to go, and I just wanted to look at other little issues that other aspects that I think might be interesting for us to highlight. I think it's important for us to, in terms of what are the spaces, the policy spaces out there that we need to be mindful of, right? So there is the Education 2030 Steering Committee that has just been reformed into, I think they're calling now high-level steering committee. But fundamentally, it's the coming together of different actors, with member states being the central actor, as I think we all have to acknowledge that they are the duty bearers. Therefore, really putting them center is important in acknowledging that they are the duty bearers, right? And then other actors come together, and this is an important space from my perspective. And I know that the Global Student Forum has been in dialogue with UNESCO to see how it can further engage. I think that this is a very important move, and it's a process. And I think that we can discuss, it would be lovely to discuss the process itself, how this can actually be consolidating as a process, really, as things move forward. But it is a space that I think is fundamental. And the Global Partnership for Education, I would highlight as the other very important space for students to be articulating in a very substantive manner. There have been conversations in the past that tried to, let's say, create a platform of actors focusing specifically around financing. And this includes the funds, right? So the GPE as a crucial fund, then Education Cannot Wait as another fund. And for a long time, the International Financing Facility for Education, IFFTU, tried to have the same footing as these other two funds. And there was a strong resistance, let's say, by many civil society actors to say, look, this financing facility is fundamentally anchored around indebtedness. It's bringing together banks, and it is centered around lending. And there was for a long time a big conversation about these should not be equated as equivalent, right? They are different things. One of them, if it is much more interrogated than the other two. Particularly the GPE is a space that is more legitimized, that has a very clear governance structure. That's not to say that it's always smooth and easy, and that there are not interrogations that should be made, but at least it's a space that can be interrogated, and where there are representations of the teacher unions, of different civil society actors and others, where a dialogue is possible. Education Cannot Wait is a fund looking particularly at emergencies, does not have the same level of development of governance as does the GPE. So I think in terms of how we move forward, it's just important to have this in mind, that although these funds have been often trying to be equated and almost unified into a single narrative, they hold their own important differences, right? So in the perspective of decision-making arenas, I can only say that from my own experience, since back then, let's say since the start of my trajectory, I think that students have been the most left out actor. That has been what I have observed. Feared really, like students they have been feared and they have been patronized in my experience. So, oh, look how they can articulate so nicely. Oh my goodness, what a very articulated intervention that was made. I have always found it to be, this combination of being intimidated by the energy and by the fearlessness of students' voice, and while at the same time a very adult-centric culture that seems to patronize the ability and the potential and the equal grounding that students have. Very contradictory to, for example, the how you say CRC, the Convention of the Rights of the Child, that includes students up to 18, where the right of participation is put as a cornerstone and very non-paternalistic or patronizing manner. It's just equal bearing, like an actor that has equal bearing. But in practice, there is a culture of either really concern patronizing. So I think that it is very, very important. And I do see progress, I have to say, of course, very contested progress, and I'm not talking about global, I'm also talking regional and especially national. But I do feel that there has been progress. I think that we have to continue this struggle. Things are process always, and it's a very, very important process to invest time and energy in. And definitely something that OSF, and now speaking particularly with my OSF hat on, right? definitely something that OSF believes in and has been supportive of. And so certainly something for us to look at as we move forward. There was another element that Sebastian had asked me to look at very quickly, which is, and I know I only have 2 minutes left, what are the main challenges around education funding globally? And I think that we have made progress around the argument that strengthening public education systems is fundamental. This narrative of the public is present to some degree in the Education 2030 Framework for Action, but there was a moment around, I don't remember what year, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, where the Global Partnership for Education was discussing the role of the private sector. And at one point, it was on the table, the question whether cooperation money, which fundamentally is public money, could go to for-profit entities. And because now, of course, I'm finishing my time, I won't be able to narrate that story or that trajectory, but let me just say that there was pushback on that. And that, in fact, we managed to get, the current special rapporteur to education, as well as the previous special rapporteurs for the right to education, UN, right, special rapporteurs, to actually write to the GPE board, expressing the importance of strengthening public education systems. And I will never forget, during one board meeting, all the actors around that table ended up in its great vast majority speaking in favor of the strengthening of public education systems. That is really a moment that I thought, my goodness, this is really quite beyond the expectation, because not only was there a drawback in saying we cannot fund through GP money for profit, but not only did we resist that, but actually we had different actors around the table speak in favor of public education. So I think that continues to be an ongoing issue that we can never drop the guard, and it's very important that we manage to keep that flagship high up. But I also actually see progress being made in another front that for long has been a flagship of ours, which is tax justice. As I mentioned, this was included in the Education 2030 Framework for Action, but in the course of the years, it has gained traction and it has gained ground with other actors, including different special rapporteurs of extreme poverty, special rapporteurs looking at debt, not to mention the education special rapporteurs. There's a committee called ICRICT that looks particularly at the issue of tax justice. Tax justice didn't make it really in terms of establishing a UN mechanism of tax justice in the negotiations of financing for development. But in the last week in Paris, there was the inauguration of the high-level committee, Education 2030 Steering Committee, and the Paris Declaration that resulted from that encounter really does speak of tax justice. And in the panel that was there for this inauguration, there was actually a specialist in tax justice that spoke to that topic. And then we had different colleagues speaking, and tax justice was very high on the agenda. So it's important, colleagues, to identify progress as well. And of course, we don't drop the guard. On the contrary, we build momentum towards these things. But privatization is still a huge problematics around education, global education financing. The narrowing is always another topic that we have to be mindful of. But we did make progress from my perspective in increased legitimacy of strengthening public education systems and around the tax justice. And to be respectful of the time, I will conclude here and happy to dialogue further. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Camilla, for this really, really insightful keynote. And I'm sure that colleagues have questions. So I would open the floor, and if you raise your hand to speak, that would be wonderful. So we see who wants to go. Anyone has any questions to Camilla? All right, we see Bismarck. Bismarck, over to you.
Hi, Camilla, thank you very much for the presentation and the insight you've given to us. I think I've realized you mentioned quite a number of stakeholders from the World Bank, you mentioned UNESCO, you mentioned GPE, you mentioned GCE and all that. I would want to know how is decision making among these bodies, where, especially in the situation where they have different opinions on education. For instance, when they are discussing issues about education as a public good, and where they have different opinions, how are these decision makings?
Okay, everybody's seen it? Well, let's start the excursion then. And if you allow me, I would first like to go back to the 80s. The early 80s. Two government leaders became the personification of the idea that we expect too much of our governments, but that government could not be the solution to all problems, and that the economy would be much better served with less regulation. In fact, with less government and more market. It was the then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Margaret Thatcher, and the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, who promoted neoliberal policy at home and abroad, opening the door for an era of unbridled globalization. National budgets were reduced, basic social services slashed, trade union freedoms curtailed, all of that making it easier for multinational enterprises to flourish and evade taxes. And all of this at the cost of working families. You could say that the 80s were marked by a neglect of public services, from education, healthcare, to public transport and infrastructure. And in the United States, they're suffering the consequences of that right now, 30 years later. And it was also marked, those years, by a widening gap between the developing world and the developed world. The international financial institutions had started imposing very harsh conditions on the poor, indebted nations. They were forced to cut back public budgets, to reform their economic systems, following the neoliberal model, and to accept international deregulation. I will never forget one of my first visits to a school in a French-speaking African country. Must have been 1983 or 1984. Early in the morning, we drove through a desert-like landscape. And we passed by a little boy who was dragging a big stone in a net along with him. And I asked my guide what that stone was for, and he explained to me that it was probably the kid's school desk. And yes, later I found out that this was indeed the case, and that the boy dragged this stone every day from his home to school and from school back home, 3 kilometers, so that the stone would not be stolen. And I learned also that this boy was to be considered privileged because he had this wonderful, magnificent stone, because he had a school he could go to school only 3 kilometers from his home, and 3, he was a boy and not a girl. That image of that little boy dragging that stone has always stayed with me as a symbol of inequality, of inequity and injustice, but also a symbol of betrayal by the Western nations, betrayal of the developing world. Now, neoliberal policy has been destructive for public education around the world, but it was outright devastating for school systems in poor countries depending on foreign aid. Teachers' organizations around the world mobilized against the reduction of their education budgets, warning that this would harm education quality and the accessibility of their schools. There were staggering illiteracy rates. In 1989, 100 million children were denied access to primary education. And that was the main reason for UNESCO, UNICEF and UNDP to convene a large international conference on education for all. And Camilla mentioned this conference. It was held in 1990 in Thailand. I was there. The conference produced glowing statements about the urgent need to achieve the right to education, and generous commitments were made by many governments. But in the following years, only few governments lived up to these commitments and to their promises, and nothing much changed. It had been, I regret to say, the well-known lip service governments used to render at their international get-togethers. And at that time, we realized that we needed to bring teachers' organizations around the world together in a new, strong, global body that would be better able to increase political pressure on the international agencies and on our own national governments. In 1993, we merged 2 international teachers' organizations, and we established Education International. Sure, concerns about the weakening of our public education systems constituted an important motive for creating EI. And the decline of the status of teachers, restrictions of our academic freedoms, but also widespread abuses of teachers' and students' human rights called for a very strong international presence. Now, we started with 225 national education unions in 129 countries, together representing 18 million teachers from preschool to university. And you would think that this should be enough for being recognized by the international community as a partner to talk to. But that this was unfortunately not the case. I need to ask you now, am I still sharing screen or not?
At the moment, no.
I'm not, okay. I hate this stuff, you know that? Sorry. Okay, well, forget the next slide. You would say 18 million, that's a respectable number. And it should give you access to all intergovernmental agencies where they talk about education and teacher policy. You would expect doors to open and to be welcomed by all these organizations existing that are talking about education and teachers all the time. Well, it was not the case. The world of intergovernmental agencies, the places where global standards and principles are set, is not a democratic environment. Governments are setting the tone and are taking the decisions. Civil society organizations have at the most a consultative status, which means that you may be invited to certain meetings and that you are allowed to listen to discussions between government delegates. And when invited, you can, yes, present your views, politely, of course. And it does not make much difference whether you represent 18 million teachers or 25 members of the Transylvanian Catholic Girl Scouts Association. I just make up this organization. My point is that the mechanism by which civil society is given a voice in the UN system is imperfect, to say the least. And you have already experienced this yourselves. UNESCO has around 500 NGOs in official partnership. The United Nations, has about, I think, 1,500. I'm not sure. I think it's about 1,500. And they all fight for a place at the table. And some use whatever means possible to conquer a seat. Some NGOs circling around these agencies, not representing anybody, but a few retired officials, only exist to occupy that seat. So if representativity is not the main criterion for taking part in the international debate, what is? Is it an organization's expertise? Is it its financial strength? Or its capacity to raise media attention and mobilize public support? I assume that it may be all of that, or nothing of that at all. Perhaps it's more personal, perhaps about a person's networking abilities, or her or his cordial relationship with the official that sells the entrance tickets. I don't know. I don't want to sound cynical, because I truly believe that the United Nations agencies are the only tools we have to set global standards and bring about democratic and social change, and that it is crucially that you fight your way in and defend your members' interests as best as you can. That's true for us representing the teaching profession, as it is for you, the international student movement. In fact, I believe that many of the spaces which we have been able to occupy in the past 30 years are as relevant for students as they are for teachers and their unions. I've listed these spaces, most of which you are familiar with, as well as the issues that are at stake. And I've put them in a document, and I think that document has been made available to you. I will come back to that later. What need to be stressed is that no matter how successful you have been in advocating standards, principles, objectives, policies, and strategies in the international arena, these ultimately have to be applied. They have to be implemented. They have to be carried out by national governments. And that may require political pressure exerted by your constituents, by your national constituents. Our international advocacy, Education International's international advocacy, would have been a useless exercise had it not been actively supported and followed up by our national member organizations. To give you an example, in 2014 and 2015, we mounted a global campaign to ensure that quality education would be one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. A year earlier, UN officials had told us that the Sustainable Development Goals were obviously objectives to reduce poverty, and that education was a means to fight poverty, not an objective, not a goal in itself. So no, there would be no SDG 4. Well, we disagreed, and so did our membership, and teachers' organizations in all regions mobilized their members on the same day, the 5th of October 2014, demanding their own governments that quality education be included in the United Nations development plans for the coming 15 years. And these national rallies and demonstrations, combined with the pressure we exerted internationally, made the UN adjust its plans. Quality education actually became SDG 4. Now, 15 years earlier, we had a similar experience when we tried to have education for all selected as one of the 8 Millennium Development Goals for what then was called the United Nations Post-2000 Development Agenda. Now, in first instance, there was some reluctance. Same argument as in 2015. Wasn't education a means to relieve poverty and not an objective? Well, I'll tell you, entering semantic discussions can be intellectually very stimulating, but with more than 100 million children knocking on school doors, it would have been a fruitless exercise. And as my father would say, if reason fails, try force. And we did, not just by organizing teachers' protests, but also by forging coalitions within the wider civil society and persuading friendly governments to our side of the aisle. And in 1999, Education International, the Global March Against Child Labor, and Oxfam Netherlands launched the Global Campaign for Education, the GCE, which developed into one of the largest campaign-based organizations in the world. And Camilla, as you were already told, had been GCE's president for a long time, and can testify to the important contributions that were made to get more children into schools and to get more qualified teachers. with the skills and tools to deliver quality education. Suffice it to say that despite all the progress made in terms of school access, quality education for all, that is for all young people from preschool to university, is still far away. And this is not just a challenge for low-income countries. And many are still unable to properly finance their public school systems and pay their teachers, but also for many rich countries, at least those still under the spell of neoliberal fantasies. One such fantasy is that when you privatize education services, when you open your school systems to the market, and when you apply market mechanisms such as continuous testing of children, high-stake evaluation of teachers, ranking of schools, that all of that will improve education performance and outcomes. And another fantasy is that technology may ultimately be driving the education process and that teachers will soon be extinct, like the lamplighters at the time of the first industrial revolution. Now, an astounding example of this way of wishful thinking was the recommendation World Bank officials made to African governments, namely to recruit volunteers rather than qualified teachers. Seriously, for a long time, the World Bank suggested African governments to simply do away with qualified teachers. Teaching wasn't really a profession. Let's quickly leave this fantasy world and ask ourselves what actually defines quality education. What is the purpose of education? Is it not remarkable that in the past 3 decades, the education agenda was not set by the organization that was established for that very purpose, UNESCO, but by the World Bank, the largest source of education loans, and by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, one of the most influential advisors of the industrial countries. In other words, the education agenda for decades has been determined by bankers and economists. And for them, I would say, education's main purpose is to contribute to economic growth, to help nations successfully compete in world markets. Now, I'm the first one to admit that this is a very important task of our school systems, but it is, or should, in my opinion, not be their prime objective. Nearly 25 years ago, the European Commission president at the time, Jacques Delors, presented UNESCO's groundbreaking report, Learning the Treasure Within. You can easily download it from the UNESCO website. And this report is still considered just as important today as it was in 1996. And it is built upon 4 pillars. Learning to know, learning to do, learning to be, and learning to live together. And for all that education teaches us to know and how to do, those are the practical skills that help us navigate life. It also holds the immense importance of passing along the democratic values on which our cultures and societies are based. And I'm afraid that when we look at what's going on in the world, dictatorships flourishing, at eroding democratic standards, growing inequity, right extremism raising its ugly head. When I look at that, it appears to me that two of Jacques Delors' 4 pillars, learning to be and learning to live together, which help establish identity, tolerance, cohesiveness, that these pillars need some serious maintenance. Actually, we run the risk of these pillars to crumble and be declared the UNESCO's World Heritage Site that you can visit on Sunday afternoons. We have consistently defended at UNESCO, OECD, and World Bank that approaches to education should be holistic and that our school systems should be publicly funded. And I dare say that UNESCO and OECD, in these organizations, or with these organizations, we have been quite successful. In 2011, we started organizing with the OECD an annual conference of education ministers and teachers union leaders discussing the future of the teaching profession. I believe that it has been EI's international advocacy flagship achievement, if you will. Not only helped it encourage and sometimes even forced governments and education unions to start a dialogue on national education and teacher policy. It also changed global narratives, puncturing some of these neoliberal fantasies I mentioned earlier. Teaching is a profession. Investments in their training are crucial, and school systems must be more equitable. But the World Bank has always been the most stubborn kid on the block. We have repeatedly and publicly challenged them for attacking teachers, for undermining quality education systems, for promoting privatization. And we have tried to engage in dialogue, in meetings, through letters, reports, other methods. But until recently, they did not give in. They continued to financially support private for-profit education operators in developing countries and some national foreign assistance agencies in the United Kingdom and in the United States, as well as many private funders joined the World Bank happy parade, so to speak. But a couple of months ago, actually last April, the World Bank changed course. It decided to freeze any direct or indirect investment in private for-profit pre-primary, primary and secondary schools. You may not be aware of this, but this is a very important moment in history of the education community. Let me put it that way. Now, why this sudden change? This sudden change of heart? Mind you, not because of successful advocacy on our part, at least not directly, but mainly because of pressure from the pro-labor majority in the United States House of Representatives, who finally showed to be susceptible to the concerns over the years expressed by our member unions in the United States, the American Federation of Teachers and the National Education Associations, but also statements made by the European Parliament and the Global Partnership for Education played a role to the bank's decision to come to their senses and, how do the English say this, hang their harp on the willows. So we are grateful for that. And I believe I also speak on behalf of the little girls selling water bottles near the traffic lights on one of the busy roads in the center of Accra. It was a hot Monday afternoon, and I was waiting for the light to jump to green. And a lot of children were circling around the vehicles trying to sell all kinds of stuff. And my eyes fell on this child, not older than 10, 11, carrying a too big and too heavy basket on her head with small water bottles. And she came up to me and wanted me to buy one of her bottles. I did, and asked her why she was selling water and not being in school. Oh, but I do go to school, she said, sounding somewhat offended, as if she had wanted to say that this was none of my business, which of course it wasn't, but that she did not want to risk losing a customer. There, she was attending classes on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday in that school. And she pointed to a place just behind the traffic lights further down the road on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. On the other days, her mother wanted her to sell water bottles down here so that she could pay for that school. Yeah, I think I need to stress here that so-called low-fee for-profit schools, they have become a widely spread, pardon my French, nuisance in low-income countries. They are to make up for the failure of impoverished public school systems to deliver quality education to all children. Private companies have created a market and business models to sell their low fee and most of the time also very low quality education to the poor. Now, we have exposed the questionable practices of one of the largest companies in this field, a US-based education business called Bridge International Academies. Now, since 1993, Education International mobilizes education unions, both in the developing and in the industrialized world, to stop their governments allowing market forces seizing control over our sector. And that includes higher and vocational education, which are particularly attractive targets. I will come back to that later. I do want to mention that in 1994, we succeeded, together with the Public Services International, to have public education and health services, these two services, exempted from being listed as tradable commodities under the General Agreement on Trades in Services, GATS, of the World Trade Organization, the WTO, a very important achievement. I remember we were lobbying against the idea of considering public education and public health services as goods that could be traded. And we informed various governments in Europe in particular, and education ministries were not even informed about the fact that their education systems were going to be listed as a tradable commodity. But we succeeded to prevent this to happen. And since then, we have put the misguided vision of education being a commodity on trial over and over again. We've been undertaking numerous studies proving our point. Clearly, quality education is a basic right paid for by governments, accountable to the people, is the only viable option. Education is one of the few instruments we have to build social cohesion, to achieve equity, to enable the transition to a sustainable economy, and to protect our democracies. It was Franklin Roosevelt who said the real safeguard of democracy is education. Well, governments delegating their responsibility for education to the private sector, whether these are businesses, religious groupings, or charities, are in fact throwing their very national defense system under the bus. And with all respect to charities, let me say that if we were to depend on the generosity of wealthy private institutions or rich individuals, we would soon find ourselves back in the dark ages. Why was this accumulated wealth not properly taxed by public authorities in the first place and then invested in public education? I find it annoying. Coming back to what I said earlier about how United Nations agencies select their civil society partners, I'm telling you that the wealthier you are, the closer you will be seated to the Secretary General. Exactly like the seating arrangements in Catholic churches from before the Enlightenment. The more you pay, the closer you'll be seated to the altar. Among the companies eager to expand their reach into education markets are multinational publishing houses like Reed Elsevier and Pearson. Pearson not only invests in for-profit education in low-income countries, it also is the largest provider of standardized tests in North America. Now, a couple of years ago, our Canadian affiliate discovered that the company, while processing tests, also on the side collected student personal data. Now, although in this case, algorithms could be swiftly adjusted and no real harm was done, alarm bells had started ringing and they have not stopped ringing since big tech has settled on our education stage. There are concerns about their influence on curricula, on other contents, and on the mining of data. Google, for example, distributes education material for free, widely and happily used by millions of teachers and students in schools and universities around the world. But as we know all too well, nothing is for free. In fact, you pay through the teeth by sharing your data, including your grandmother's favorite dessert, and sometimes even without knowing it. It's an issue to be dealt with internationally. We need global standards. The same goes for reasonable access to copyrighted material for educational purposes, which is coordinated by the World Intellectual Property Organizations. Again, these are issues important to both student unions and teachers' organizations. 2 years ago, at our World Congress in Thailand, I told delegates from our higher education section about the adventures of a public university of the northern Dutch city of Groningen. The university board was eager to follow the example of many of its sister universities and decided to extend its borders to the big world outside. Now, 50 years ago, everybody would have understood such ambition as a decision to distinguish oneself by excellent education and groundbreaking research. But that's no longer always the case. Today, many universities measure their standing and status in the world by the number of campuses they have been able to establish across borders and the amount of private funds they have been able to establish, to collect. So the University of Groningen went to, yes, of course, you guess it, China. To set up a branch campus in the city of Yantai. China is the second largest funder of scientific research in the world. And I suppose the thinking goes that you would be crazy not to make an effort to get a piece of that pie. Academic freedom, well, we will deal with that on Chinese soil. Let's first hit the jackpot. But there was bad luck for our friends from Groningen. Not long after the last documents had been signed, a newspaper found out that they had illegally used taxpayer money for their investment. So their Chinese adventure had to be cut short. I shared this story with my colleagues then and with you today because it captures a problem which I believe should preoccupy the student movement. It's about the role of universities as public institutions serving the common good. It's about their struggle for public funds. It's about the ever increasing pressure by market forces on research and education. And it's about the effects on academic freedom, on open access, and of course, on students' learning conditions. And we know that being assertive on academic freedom may not always help getting contracts renewed. Security of employment with decent conditions for our members, collegiality and good governance, and academic freedoms, they are all part of that same package. And when they are all respected, they make a virtual circle. But when they are all violated, that circle will be a very vicious one. In 1997, we had the UNESCO adopt a recommendation on the status of higher education teaching personnel, which sets global standards on most of these issues, academic freedom being the most crucial one. The recommendation gives us a global instrument to take governments and universities to task. And some governments have little respect for academic freedom and the independence of higher education. We all know the examples, such as the closure of the Central European University in Budapest by Viktor Orban. And there's also saber rattling against universities in the Philippines, in Brazil, in Turkey, and in other places. University independence cannot exist without sufficient financial independence. And one way to try to cope with the impact of austerity programs on university budgets is to seek funding in other countries, such as China, like our friends from Holland did, or to establish partnerships with private companies. And that is like choosing between a rock and a hard place. Also, the closing of faculties that we are told have no economic relevance. And we see it happening in many places. It says it all. My point is that academic freedom is on the one hand under attack from the new authoritarian regimes, and on the other hand by market-led pressures, not to mention the professors who combine their teaching and researching with lucrative jobs on the side in the world of commerce. All of this undermines the role of universities in terms of being bastions of critical thinking and independent judgment, and should be of concern to students. And it may be time for you to get more engaged and raise your voice in our international arena. For example, I think that in addition to the UNESCO recommendation on the status of teachers and the one covering higher education personnel, there should also be a UNESCO instrument to protect the rights and interests of students. But there are more domains where strong global student organization like GSF could make an important difference. The protection of democracy and civil rights, or in the field of development cooperation, helping students in low-income countries build strong, independent, democratic, national student unions. But there are no shortcuts to success, and hanging around in the halls of the UN agencies. And frankly, it's not always very entertaining. When I started my own 30, 40 years excursion into this world, I was warned by the General Secretary of a British teachers union who described international conferences as the enunciation of the obvious by the boring for the uninterested. And he said, you may die of boredom, Fred. Well, I didn't, as you can see, but it's true. There's a lot of endless blah, blah and self-congratulatory declarations to endure. But at the same time, there are opportunities to seize that can make a tremendous difference to your members and perhaps even to the world. Where are I, Sebastian, in terms of minutes?
We are 1 hour, 10 minutes into the session, but we started a bit later, and I think take the time that you need to say.
Okay. Nobody has yet fallen asleep. Well, I do want to show or at least try to once again share my screen. I think that it is this screen that I want to share. You see something?
Yes.
Am I sharing?
Yes, you're sharing.
Okay.
I can see it full screen.
Okay. I have actually done the following. I give an overview of what's at stake. I try to show the spaces that are important, and then the players who are on the chessboard, so to speak. Well, here are the stakes from the perspective of the Education International. But I believe, as I said earlier, that some of these stakes are of importance to students also. Education being a basic social service versus education as a commodity. What I've done is showing the conflict, and we heard this before, I believe, from Camilla. It's important to understand that a lot of conflicting views are circling around in these spaces that we hope you one day will occupy. So, what are the stakes? I have listed 5. Education as a basic social service versus education as a commodity. Meeting the educational needs of democratic societies versus the needs of the market economy. education financed by the state versus by business or charity. Well, I'm not going to read it all, but I believe that they're clear enough. This with respect to the education systems, the stakes with respect to education content. We have the holistic approach to education versus an education driven by consumers' demands. I believe that education is both an individual and a collective right. It's not just that parents can choose what curriculum should be followed by schools. That is a task of the government, of a government elected, because education is also a collective right. So there is this tension, I would say, between education, the holistic approach of education versus education driven by consumers' demand. Schools cultivating a culture of cooperation and tolerance, or a culture of competition. And then we are still struggling with these contradictions. Not everything that's valuable can be measured. Some governments believe that everything that's done in education can be measured. Well, it's not possible. But then some of these governments say what cannot be measured is not worth to be funded. So we're fighting about that in the international community. When it comes to education staff, the stakes are clear. There should be more professional autonomy. Teachers should be leading the profession, the educational process. And teachers' shortages should be fought by making the profession more attractive, rather than employing unqualified persons and volunteers. Let's move to the spaces. You've heard these organizations mentioned already. We have the United Nations system here in blue, UNESCO being the lead agency, but all the other agencies do have, one way or the other, education programs, and also have particular interests in helping develop education policy and programs. On the right hand, you have the OECD, like I said, a very important organization when it comes to giving advice to the industrialized nations, and not only on economic and social matters, but particularly also on education. We have there the World Trade Organization. We have on the left side 3 organizations of great relevance as well. There is, of course, the World Bank as the largest funder of education in the developing world. More or less connected to the World Bank is the Global Partnership for Education. I believe they're still linked to the World Bank, but Camilla would be in a better position to explain this. But it is a World Bank hosted entity that over the years has shown a more independent approach to education and to its needs and to the policies that are required. And I think Camilla has given happy examples of this earlier than was the case in the past, because I remember the birth of the Global Partnership of Education and its predecessors. Some were really very close to the World Bank, and more or less the executive arm of World Bank policies and strategies, but that's no longer the case. And then, of course, IMF although not directly involved in education, they do have great influence on the finance ministries in particularly developing countries, and therefore indirectly great influence on education and social budgets. Let's have a quick look at the players. Well, who are in those spaces that we just looked at? Governments, business, organized labor, civil society organizations, and individuals. Here we see how, undemocratic this whole system actually is. Let's have a look at the civil society organizations. You have membership-based organizations such as EI and your own organization, Global Student Forum. You have campaign-based organizations like the Global Campaign for Education, Save the Children. Mind you, I have done this, made this overview, and I'm sure that when I throw it in the group, it would be controversial, because some people say, no, that's not that we are also a membership-based organization. I think the Global Campaign would say that. I, however, prefer to list them as campaign-based organizations, because they have been established for a very specific purpose, namely a campaign, an education for all campaign. Okay, then you have, but I'm always willing to change my view on this. Then you have think tanks and research organizations, always welcome in the United Nations system. They don't need a special ticket. They always sit on the first row. You have the business-based organizations. I mention here the World Innovation Summit for Education, WISE, which is, I think it's based in Doha, one of the Gulf states, and it has over the years become quite an influential player in what Camilla always calls the education community, and particularly promoting commercialization, use of more technology in education, etc., etc. Then you have the World Economic Forum, the famous Davos Club. Their influence should not be underestimated. But I must say that I had the honor of participating in the Davos meetings from 2001 till 2017. So I know the organization, the forum, a little bit. It does, and I would not be surprised, let me say this, and I'm looking at Sebastian in particular, if, the WEF would be willing to also allow GCF to take part in their annual Davos meetings. I mean, not all your members may be happy with this, but it does give you the opportunity to have informal discussions with quite influential people in the world of business. I believe that EI has been able to persuade some of these people that privatization of education is a bad thing. I've been talking to CEOs of important companies who actually turned out to be as opposed to privatization as we are, and willing to help us persuade certain governments to not open their school systems to the market. Anyway, the point here is that they are an important NGO, as is the Vaki Foundation, which, by the way, is the foundation established by a company that itself is providing education already for a long time. They have a lot of private schools in Switzerland, and then funding agencies and active when it comes to development, which are charity oriented, such as the Open Society Foundations, the Bill Gates Foundation, Oxfam International Action Aid, also very welcome in the United Nations system, because everybody knows they carry a lot of, money around. They can throw a lot of money around, and everybody, let's not beat about the bush. Everybody would like to be friends with them, because you never know. And I'm sure Camilla has something to say to this. And then finally, I've also listed individuals. The UN, they invite whoever they want. I will never forget 2016, and then 2015 or 2016. I'm sure Camilla remembers that as well. The United Nations, they suddenly presented the youth representative who got the floor at the UN Assembly, believe it or not. Now, who was this person? A very nice boy, and he could speak well, but he was simply selected by the United Nations as an individual to do a little act. And then they put the label youth representative on it. They do it all the time. They like to pick their own representatives. And you have already experienced this. This is not acceptable. This is not acceptable. I think that this is another reason for the student movement to actually claim the right to participate at all these levels, to be present in all these spaces. I think Camilla mentioned it as well. Yeah, you should make a lot of noise, otherwise you will not actually be kindly accepted around the table. You will have to fight for it. Individuals, well, you have celebrities, of course, when a movie star wants to, happens to be in New York and they want to address the United Nations. No problem. And then, of course, the wealthy individuals. So those are the players. And you will have to find a way to get in there. But I'm sure that you will succeed. And I am convinced that when you're able to mobilize your members, your national student unions, and have them exert pressure on their national governments to support your claims, that you will succeed, that you will soon be a respected member of the international community. We need young people to get more engaged at these levels, and I really hope that you will be able to do this. There should be no misunderstanding that you will have the report of support of Education International. We will do whatever we can to help you find your place and settle in the international arena. How many minutes now, Seb?
I think we're a bit over it, but
sorry.
no, but I think it's very interesting. So maybe another 5 or so, and then we go to the discussion.
I'll stop sharing.
Okay. But Fred, we don't need to cut off here. If you want to go for a bit more. Really.
No. I'm retired, remember, and it's a Sunday.
Fair enough. All right, then a big thank you for this presentation, and we're going to do the same as we did before after Camilla's presentation. If you want to ask a question, if you have any comments, anything you want to share with colleagues, raise your hand, and we're going to open the floor. Anyone who wants to go? You're usually not that shy. What's going on? Anyone has a question to Fred?
Maybe it has been a long day and everyone is tired by now. That is at least my case.
Very good, Abu. I see Bismarck and Camilla.
I seem to be the usual culprit. Thank you very much, Mr. Fred Van, for this insight. I think you have touched on a lot of things. I had the mention of Accra, where I stay. It was excited story you told, and I want
You know
to
the
say
girl.
I don't know the girl. I don't know the girl, but I've seen a lot of those incidences. A lot of girls who sell a lot of things by the roadside just to be able to get money to go to school. And the system has not changed much. I understand this happened somewhere in the 1990s, right? This happened in the 1990s?
No. I was actually referring to an experience that I had only a couple of years ago.
Okay. So the phenomenon is quite the same, and the same across Africa. And I think a lot of the main reason is that education has largely been privatized. It is only the private schools that enjoy what we call quality education, and then the public sector, I won't say they are refusing, but investment in basic education especially, it's annually being cut down. Budgetary allocations are always being cut down. So I understand your plight and the seriousness to attach to that comment. I also took note of the role you've asked us to play as students and as student unions, especially when it comes to advocating for education to be treated as a public good and not as a commodity that people can make a lot of money out of. And so that's why I asked in the earlier question to our earlier speaker, Camilla, about how these institutions differ when it comes to their opinions on treating education as public education. And then I think your insight on the World Bank and others have really elaborated how the stakes are high in that. So I've taken note of that, and I think the GSF and us are ready to take on that advocacy. From the way you spoke, it seems that is on your heart, and I think you have to take that up. On Wednesday, 17th of November, which is the International Students' Day, we in Accra, the All African Students Union, are actually working with Oxfam and some other organizations here in Ghana, the Ghana National Association of Teachers, the National Association of Graduate Teachers, and some other organizations. GNAT, GNAT and NAGRAT and Oxfam. We have a coalition here called CAPCO, that is the Coalition Against the Privatization and Commercialization of Education. And so on Wednesday, we intend to picket around the Parliament House, where our decision makers are going to pass laws. Luckily for us, that day happens to the day they are going to read the new budget. And we just have a publication that has indicated that basic education budget has always been cut, and we have advocated that they should increase basic education budget by 50%. We hope and pray that they pay heed to that advice and they have increased the budget. But on Wednesday, we will get to know. But until then, we intend to picket around the school to put more pressure. And so I just want to say that thank you very much for this insight. The slides you presented, the latter slide, I hope you can share that with us, because I thought the information, they were very loaded. I like the way you were able to touch on everything. But when it came to the players in education space, I didn't hear you see, or I didn't see the mention of universities in there. Which category would they fall? I see teacher unions in there. I see ILO, but I didn't see universities specifically. Is it because we are looking at the teachers and the students, or can we also categorize universities as some of the players in the education space, and how are they being involved in the struggle? Thank you.